Trafford means that we've got time for an extra programme now on BBC Two. Jeremy Isaacs talks to David Hockney in a programme recorded in Los Angeles in November 1993.
David Hockney, you're one of the best known and one of the most enjoyed painters of our day. When you paint, are you describing the world or are you inventing a world of your own?
Well, a little bit of both, because you have to invent your own world actually based on from experience. I mean, you can't totally divorce the real world from it. You do. So there's a little bit of both, but I think perhaps more strongly people make their own world in pictures. But after all, as I say, you have to begin with something, and we usually begin with nature in a way.
Is abstraction and depiction the same thing or quite different things in painting?
Well, I suppose you could say both, you see. I mean, for myself, I've come to a kind of position where you can't differentiate. Everything is an abstraction or a representation in a way. And it's a very I must admit, it's a difficult area for some people to grasp, actually, because it's what's understanding what abstraction actually is. And for instance, if anybody knows movies, for example, and if you know Citizen Kane and you look at it, you can understand they knew the power of abstraction and use it marvelously, whereas I'm not sure they do in movies today the same way. They seem a bit remote from it. It's not as powerful in that sense, but it's difficult to define exactly what depiction is and what abstraction is, because they do overlap. They are very closely similar, I think, very same.
Your latest paintings, you call them very new paintings, appear to start something. I think you say yourself that you've started something new. Could you say what that new thing in your painting is?
Well, I call them very new paintings simply because they were my paintings. I mean, but with a little tongue-in-cheek, realizing you're also being cheeky as well. But they were new to me. I mean, what got me excited was the fact that it seemed you could start making very exciting spaces if you look at them in a certain way, and that's what excited me, and I get going on it. But whether they work for all others, I don't know, but they do work for some people, and others found them difficult, found them even eye-boggling, whereas other people went into the space, amazingly. I don't know, it's not my concern how it affects others, I don't suppose, too much, really.
At 56, you've just published As I See It, a book about painting, and a sort of autobiography. Is this a time in your life when you feel like looking back?
Well, just because of the books there, I do, but I'm not in the habit of looking back very much. I've always said I don't really hold many inquests. I just... Frankly, to me, there's only now, really. On the other hand, I'm very aware that if you don't do something like putting that book together, in a way, people don't really know what you've done. I mean, exhibitions, there's not that many people go see exhibitions. If you paint pictures, not that many people see them. And I knew, in a way, if you don't make reproductions, very few people see them. Make a book, explain them or something. Well, frankly, most artists get somebody else to do it, but I've decided, well, I might as well do it myself. I think I can explain it just as much as anybody else could, or just as well.
You say you live for now, or that it's now that interests you, but what have you learned as life goes on?
Well, the past is part of now, for a start. I think when I say there's only now, I'm only pointing out that somehow that's the experience we're having is now, and the past and the future are tied in with it in a way. I mean, I do look back, I am reflective at times, but I found, as I say, I think you do have to deal with now if you want to get on with things and you want to be active. I think if you look back too much, it's, well, it seems as though you're inactive now, that's what it means, really. Look at George Burns, you know, he doesn't go on thinking about Gracie, he does something else, doesn't he?
Let's look back a bit. Where were you born?
Bradford.
Who were your parents?
Kenneth and Laura Hockney.
What did your father do?
My father was he was a clerk, actually. I mean, for 28 years he worked for dry salters in Bradford. Then he left because he thought there weren't any prospects, but he'd stuck there 28 years. Then he worked in different places in Bradford, usually as a kind of clerk in an accountant's office, but he wasn't a proper accountant, actually.
What sort of person was he?
Well, he was very, my mother would say he was very comic. We always thought he was rather eccentric, although now I can now realize, for instance, he went pretty deaf at the age of 50. He'd always been tone deaf. He couldn't tell the difference between a piece of music. I mean, I did remember the family favourites program on a Sunday. We're all sitting around the table, and on the radio was Mendelssohn's Wedding March, which my mother looked up and said, "Oh, do you remember this, Kenneth?" And we all looked round at him, expecting him to say yes, but he was obviously confused by the question, gets up to the radio, listens very carefully at right up against it, looks at us, knows we think he's Charlie Chaplin's #1 fan, comes back and says, "Yes, it's Charlie Chaplin's Limelight." Well, my mother was a bit disappointed.
Was he artistic at all?
Well, yes, in a way. I mean, he used to go, he'd attended art school in Bradford in the 20s, evening classes that were called Light and Shade, actually. He attended classes that were called that because, again, remember when they had the Leonardo cartoon, he said to me, yes, he'd studied things like that. It's called Light and Shade. Nobody studies light and shade. Now, it's actually a very interesting thing to study, really, chiaroscuro, but I don't think anybody at art school would do that now.
Was your mother a creative person?
She just was a busy mother. I mean, creative in the garden. She loved the garden. I mean, to her, yeah, that's creative, watching a garden grow, really, making it. She made a garden. But my father did actually like getting brushes out and painting signs, or paint a sign for anybody on the street, you know, anything. I think he would have liked to have been an artist, actually. I think it's just I mean, I'm sure it was circumstances of the time and so on.
When you were a child, did you know what an artist was?
Well, we didn't know any artists, you see. I mean, didn't know anybody who made their living as an artist, actually. So I didn't know yet. You know, you look at great pictures and you think, well, somebody made these and they must be an artist, but where are they now? I mean, I can remember the first professional artist I met who wasn't a teacher in an art school, for example. That was Jacob Kramer in Leeds, in the 50s. And there were paintings of his in the art gallery, and he didn't teach. I do remember that, and I thought, well, he's a really proper artist. I mean, really. I was very impressed to meet him, yeah.
Did you think you might be an artist then?
Yes, I always wanted to be an artist, but as I say, I mean, the mechanics of it, I'd never bothered about. Of course, neither did my parents, actually. I mean, when I left the Royal College of Art, for instance, and I said to my mother, well, I'm going to do a bit of teaching at the Maidstone School of Art, and my mother's immediate question was, well, are you qualified for that? I mean, assuming you were qualified to be an artist, you see. She separated the two.
Was your childhood happy?
Yes, looking back on it now, again, when you're reflective, so I do look back, and I look back and realise, yes, it was rich and happy, yes, it was, yeah.
Before you went to the Royal College of Art, you were a conscientious objector and did national service as a hospital orderly. Why were you a conscientious objector?
Well, if you remember at the time, I think they were fighting in Cyprus, actually. There was a kind of colonial war going on. And I must admit, I thought about it. I thought, I cannot really do this. I could not do it. And I found out you could do this, really. So I did, actually. And frankly, I think the army was better off without me anyway, really. I don't think I would have been suitable.
Well, are you a nonconformist by nature?
In a way. I mean, I say I've never claimed to be a respectable person. I'm not really, in that sense. But now it's a bit different, you see. As I say, if you can't hear, it makes a bit of a difference now. People think you're just not listening to them. Well, it's actually, I'm just not hearing them, that's all. I might be attempting to listen. So I suppose that has an effect as well. But
do you think of yourself as a Yorkshireman in any sense?
Well, I am a Yorkshireman. What else? That's where I come from.
You've never gone back there to live and work. You visit.
I visit, but I could actually, I've thought now I could paint Yorkshire, actually, again. I've been away long enough to see it a little differently, really, and I go a lot. I go to Yorkshire far more than I go to London, because my sister lives in Bridlington. I like it. It's very, very unspoiled part of England, rather very old-fashioned, really. Much more like the England of my childhood, oddly enough. So I like going. And I could work there. I realised I could paint there, and I think the landscape would have its effect on me now, because if you fly there straight from LA, first of all, you're struck by how green it is, how really, really green. Here, after all, at this time of year, everything's brown and gold.
When you were at the Royal College of Art in London in the 1960s, was that an exciting time to be there, to be a student there? Or yes. To be in London then?
Yes, it was. I mean, it might still be, but I mean, remember, I'm very provincial in the sense that, I was 18 years old when I first visited London. On our street, we didn't know people who'd been there. I mean, it was as far away as America or anything. And I only went to live there when I was 22, 1959. Well, of course I thought it was exciting, thrilling, all kinds of things. I remember West Side Story just opened, which I saw. I started going to the theatre. I mean, it was thrilling, yeah.
About then, you must have realised that you were gay. Was that a difficult thing at that time in London?
Well, not at the Royal College of Art, really. Frankly, I'd just met Quentin Crisp in the Royal College of Art. He was a model, and he was actually the first person I'd ever met who said he was gay, and he seemed a very balanced person to me. And frankly, it's easy in that kind of community, remember. Yes, it is it's not a difficult thing to face and have everybody around you, yeah.
Was it a good place to learn to paint?
Well, it was very exciting at that time. I mean, looking back now, it was a very lively period, that whole period. But at the time, you know, at one time, at the end of my first year, I think at the Royal College of Art, they said that we were the worst year they'd had for 30 years or something. Well, even I knew that wasn't true. I mean, I looked around and thought, well, I can see that's not true. I mean, looked rather lively. But I think the way they ran the Royal College of Art then, they weren't quite sure what the students were doing, but it didn't matter. It was run quite well, rather well. I mean, in those days, they still did drawing, had life rooms and things like that. I mean, and in a way, they left you to yourself.
You were very successful very early. Was that nice?
Well, it depends what you mean by success. I mean, I'd started selling paintings when I was a student at the Royal College of Art. But I mean, they were £10, 20. I was a rich student. I'd become quite a rich student, rich by student standards. I could buy packets of 20 cigarettes. Everybody else bought 10. And I had proper oil paint. I mean, I immediately always started buying better quality paint and canvas, things like that. In fact, I never thought of oneself as success. I mean, the fact that when I left the Royal College of Art, and I did teach for about 6 months etching. I taught 1 day a week at Maidstone. And then one month, I realised I'd forgotten about the cheque, £90 or something, and I thought, God, I can manage. If I can manage without it, why bother doing even that? And I'd rather do my own work every day.
When you paint, doing your own work every day, do you paint every day, one day after another?
When I'm painting, if I'm painting, yes, I do, actually. I mean, whatever I do, I tend to do they're either a big project, you know, with a deadline, like in the theatre. You have to accept there's a deadline, certain deadline. In painting, I don't want any deadlines. I mean, I fix them afterwards. But, and I prefer being on my own, utterly on my own, painting. I prefer the room empty. I never listen to music when I paint. I can't really. I can't. I just wouldn't be hearing it anyway, and I'd turn off the noise. It would just become noise, and I'd turn it off. And I must admit, every time I finish quite a lot of things in the theatre, I simply really want to go back to that kind of solitude. It's fun, the theatre, but I like my...
How many hours can you paint for at a stretch?
Oh, well, if you get going and it's quite intense, I can go 5 or 6 hours before you really stop to eat or something. And even then, sometimes I can go longer. I mean, it depends how excited you are, really.
When you are looking at painting, what are you looking for in a painting?
Well, it depends what the painting... I mean, I don't know whether you take something to say what are you looking for in a painting. I mean, painting is a very, very wide activity. I mean, extremely wide when you think about what can be done in it. But I don't look for anything particular. I mean, for instance, the other day I got a catalogue. I think the Royal Academy sent it to me, and it was called the Golden Age of English Watercolours. I didn't see the exhibition, but I saw the catalogue. And I opened the catalogue, and I'm looking at it, and I think, God, they are marvellous. This is England. This is pictures of a landscape. And I think, supposing these were photographs, how dull it would be. Because although you're looking at, say, landscape, every time you turn the page, there's another way of looking at it. There's a look at what he saw, shadows and things which are difficult in photography and can be marvelous in painting. And I remember spending hours looking through it, and I thought it's a marvelously beautiful book, and it shows you what painting can do and how really what photography can't, I think. And unfortunately, even topographical painting like that, not many people do anymore. But
what painters do you admire?
Well, I like painting, so I admire what most people know are the great masters of painting. So in that sense, we know who they are. There's Picasso, Matisse, Bonnard, Vuillard, and so on. They are actually the best painters. Since then, painting has changed a little, or people think it has, but I mean, that was a golden age in our time, and I am still affected by it. But I'm affected by all kinds of art, actually. I can be.
You had a marvelous experience that you describe in China, looking at a Chinese scroll. What did that mean to you?
Well, actually, it wasn't in China, that scroll. In China, we saw very little Chinese art. Yeah. But I did become interested in Chinese painting, for instance, is a thing even Western art historians can be very ignorant about, not know much. And I got interested, oddly enough, through a kind of theoretical interest because of their attitude to perspective. And one day, it was a Sunday, I went in the Met, and the curator of Chinese art showed me a 70-foot scroll on the floor upstairs. And I must admit, it was one of the great days of my life. I mean, it was like you discovering, you know, a great artist or something. And we spent 4 hours looking at it. And I'd never quite seen anything like it. I thought it was obviously masterly as well. I mean, everything about it. And it was very vivid. You don't have days, there aren't that many days I can remember that are like that, especially with pictures. I think, you know, I've seen a lot of pictures, I've seen them in books, I wouldn't be too surprised by a lot of things, but this was thrilling, and you realize they can't be exhibited that well, actually. The only true way you can see them is very privately.
What about photography? What can painters learn from photography?
What can painters learn from photography?
Why is photography interesting to you?
Well, because it's a picture. I'm interested in pictures, and photography is a photograph is a way of making a picture. Of course it interests me. Most people do it anyway. Most people used a camera. I've used a camera for a long time, but I must admit, I do get bored with that kind of the world as seen through the camera. I mean, I must admit, I think, as I pointed out, that Royal Academy catalogue, it showed you how dull the camera is in some ways. That's what I meant.
You've chosen to live in California. Why is that?
Well, I came here 30 years ago. I think there were many reasons that pulled me here. I can think of them. I've always said, well, it was sexy, fresh, new. Everybody came from somewhere else here. I mean, it's a quite recent city, Los Angeles, really. But over the years, I've also realized one of its thrills for me is how spatial it is, and that I've actually suffered a bit from claustrophobia, which is probably over the years why I've avoided New York and spent the time here. And I do like going out into the desert a lot here. I like that. I mean, there's a certain marvellous solitude there.
Is painting a lonely activity?
Really, yes, it is. You have to do it on your own. Yes, it is.
Are you a lonely person?
I'm a loner. I'm not sure. At times I'm lonely, but I just accept that's part of life, really. You know, I mean, if somebody says, are you happy? I'd say, well, of course you don't look at it that way. You just merely get glimpses of it, you know, and that's sufficient. Keeps you going, and the human contacts I have keep me going. But I mean, I must admit, I couldn't stand it if I couldn't be alone for quite a lot of the day.
What about your deafness? Has that altered the way you feel about things?
Well, obviously it's doing. I mean, you don't know yourself, really. I could tell it would make anybody antisocial, because it makes it, if you can't hear people, you withdraw more into yourself. What I do now, I avoid large rooms with a lot of people talking, because frankly I can't hear the person next to me then. So I simply go for 5 minutes and be polite and leave, or something like that. But I do think of other things, other aspects of it. You see, my father went deaf, but he did not, I think, he didn't fully realize how deaf he was, and that everybody did not hear like that. For instance, my father used to complain bitterly about the organ at the chapel up the road that my mother went to. He'd never go, because he said this organ sounded terrible. Now, to us it sounded rather sweet, actually, but I now realise that there's certain pitches like that, it would sound terrible to him. He didn't realise it wasn't sounding like that to everybody else. Now, I've wondered if you're very aware of it, if you're not using your ears as much, maybe you use your eyes more, because I did notice that at the time I began to realise I was going deaf, I got more and more interested in space in pictures. Now, I can realise that. I look back and I can see, yes, I was aware of I was losing hearing then. Are these connected? Do they make you see a keener space? I do not know. I mean, nobody'd know this was happening to you unless you were an artist anyway doing something about it.
Goya was deaf.
Goya
Do you think that affected his painting?
Well, I learned to look at them not long ago, actually, in Madrid. You know, the last paintings, the black paintings, and he went stone deaf. Now, I'm not stone deaf. I mean, stone deaf is a thing where you're really hardly hearing sounds at all. And when you look at the paintings and all those other screaming, you know, the screaming faces, they would have been silent to him, which might have emphasized, made a greater emphasis on what the facial expressions were doing. I mean, you have to fill in for this lack of sound in a way. And I think people would do it in different ways. But I've looked at them now from that point of view. I tried to look at them thinking, take away sound, take away noise, take away the bustle that's there. And perhaps that's why he would focus on certain things. I don't know, but...
Your father died a few years ago. What did you feel about that?
Well, I felt sad and things, but he'd always said, don't mourn him, he said to us. That whatever happened, he'd had a rich life, he thought. And he said that, but of course you do. I mean, you break down. But I do remember he used to, on a little card we put in, he was cremated, and he always had these day-glow little things he put on his letters to emphasize things. And I put them all round it, actually, which the funeral people thought was a bit odd, but I thought was in his spirit, really.
You've lost friends recently from AIDS. Do you mourn them?
Well, every day, really. You think about them every day and then you stop it because there's too many, actually. And it would rather drive you mad if you think about it. And slowly you have to realize it's kind of it's become part of your life, this something you never ever expected. I mean, it's difficult. In a way, I know I have a lot of friends who are in the same, I do talk to them who are in the same predicament. They always say they have to block it out of their mind at times. There's no way, otherwise it's difficult to live, I think.
Much of your working life, you've worked in the theatre. What's the appeal to you of designing for the theatre?
Well, mostly music. I mean, I've only done... It's the musical theatre I've worked in.
Opera.
Opera, and a very non-commercial musical theatre. I mean, simply because the music's better, really, and I needed... I've now realised for the theatre, I need the music to turn me on, really. The very first thing I did in the theatre was Ubu Ra, which was, of course, Alfred Jarry's play. But then I didn't do anything for 9 years, so I assumed the theatre world didn't really like it or something. And it's, frankly, the world of opera that drew me, simply because people asked me in, and I got very interested when I went in.
The other day, you were able to see a show of yours in San Francisco, Turandot, and another show of yours, Die Frau in Schatten, in Los Angeles. That must have been a hell of a day for you.
Well, I did, yes. It was a bit mad because they're two enormous pieces of theatre, really. And I must admit, I was a bit mad when I realized they were almost overlapping. In technical rehearsals, I kept going back and forth, and I pointed out to Ian, who did the costumes, I said, you know, there's a day where we can see both of these massive things. And in the afternoon, we were here in LA seeing the dress rehearsal, and then we flew up to San Francisco and saw Turandot, and I hope never to do that again, because I hope it'll never happen that way for me again.
In Los Angeles, there have been these fires which came near your home in Malibu. Where were you when the fire?
Frankly, I was up in the Hollywood Hills, and I watched it on television. A thing I rarely watch television, but of course live television is amazing, and I watched it because I saw where the fires are actually all on the drive, my Wagner drive. I used to take people. Well, I've pointed out, I'm sure it will still work with the music because the forms of nature have not changed to merely the surface, little things on the surface. But I must admit, I watched it on Monday, and there on the TV screen I see my little house and the fire's burning across the road. And frankly, I thought I'd lost it, really, but I just shrugged my shoulder. I mean, nobody in it. It's all right.
Could you paint fire?
Well, I must admit, watching the pictures of it, which were beautiful in a way, I mean, horrible beauty, but they were quite spectacular. I don't know. I mean, it's not interested me the same as water has. Water's more interesting from other aspects. We must have come out of it and so on. Fire is, but it's like, I mean, as I've talked about living in Malibu, where you live on the living edge of the ocean, it's not the horizon dominates you, it's living water. And that's as fascinating as fire. I mean, we are all fascinated looking at fire, of course. It'll always attract us. But the only fire I've painted, frankly, was in the Magic Flute.
The designs you've done for Richard Strauss's Frau in the Schatten end with a great assertion of the life force. You put human sperm on the operatic stage. Was it that in the piece that appealed to you? Are you trying to say something in that?
Well, actually, it wasn't just sperm. It was, there's a river in the back, and the river, there's a twisting line, which was meant to represent the life force that the opera's about. But right at the end, it changes into another wiggly line like that could be the tree of life, sperm. It could be, I mean, you can interpret it. I didn't say what it was, but you can see where it came from. The form didn't just appear. It came out of something at the back. To me, the opera was an affirmation of a life force that is beautiful. That's one reason I wanted to do it, but another reason was I knew it was meant to be a great big show. It's meant to be a great big piece of musical theatre that attracted me. But I did like its message, you know, yes. I think it is, you know, I mean, it is quite deep. And I felt I could help stage it. It's a difficult piece to stage at all. And I felt I understood some of it, really.
What would you most like one day, far off, I hope, to be remembered by?
Be remembered by? I don't know. I must admit I don't think about posterity too much. I'd like to think frankly, I hadn't really hurt anybody, or I'd been reasonably kind to my friends. As for my art, I've no idea. I mean, I like to think some of the books will survive even if the paintings don't. But I don't worry about it too much, actually.